The Wagner mercenary group's failed mutiny in Russia is likely to have repercussions for several African countries where thousands of fighters are based. It's still unclear whether Wagner's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who has relocated to Belarus, will continue to run his security contracts in places like the Central African Republic, Sudan and Mali. It's a lucrative enterprise that channels billions of dollars of cash, gold and diamonds around the world. Dr. Andreas Krieg is Associate Professor of Security Studies at King's College London and our guest this morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Patricia.
As Russia disbands the Wagner operation that operates in Ukraine, is this the end of the group's global operations too?
Very unlikely. I mean, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty still about what's going to happen, what the deal is really, where Prigozhin is at the moment, and what deal most of the Wagner mercenaries will actually accept in the end. But what can be said is that Wagner Group is a globally operating network of different businesses and companies who are involved not just in war fighting, but in psychological warfare, in extraction businesses, logistics. And, you know, there are dozens and dozens of companies who are based all over Africa, some of them operating South America and the Middle East, and they're all kind of dissociated from one another to an extent, particularly dissociated from the core business that we've always looked upon, which is their operations in Ukraine. So whatever happens in Russia and Ukraine to Wagner doesn't necessarily affect their very lucrative business of diamond, gold and oil trade in the Middle East and in Africa, because they've been paid independently from the Russian state and can operate more or less autonomously.
So what's happening right now? Is Wagner continuing to operate as usual in Africa, or has there been any shift in their operations?
No, we've seen already this shift in operations since February 2022, since the war in Ukraine began, because some of the battle-hardened fighters had to relocate from Africa or the Middle East to Ukraine, and they've been really drawn in, and they were really the pioneers on the forefront of operations in Ukraine, but very much the backbone of Russian operations in Bakhmut and other areas. And so that has drawn in a lot of capacity, and the bandwidth of that Wagner once had before the war has certainly shrunk. But we still have loads and loads of fighters in places in Africa, even in Syria, where most of the operations have really calmed down over the last couple of years. But these people are still there, and while the bandwidth has been somewhat constrained because of operations in Ukraine, it doesn't mean that operations have ceased, because, as I said before, I mean, this is where they make their money. And for Prigozhin and particularly the battle-hardened inner core of Wagner, they don't really care about Russia that much, and they care probably more about making money and staying afloat and becoming more independent of the Russian state.
Do we know yet if Prigozhin will be allowed to run and control his African contracts from Belarus?
That's a big question mark, but there is a lot to say that he probably will be able to do that, because it was set up from the beginning by Putin and the Kremlin as a self-funding enterprise or network of companies that were able to operate without the Russian state having to pour money in, and with it came a degree of autonomy. And so in each of these individual countries, whether it's in Sudan or in Libya or Central African Republic, Mali, we have individual branches of the company operating independently with their own kind of command structure. And they will likely continue to do so. And Putin has an interest to keep it going, because it's a very important tool of Russian statecraft, in a way providing capabilities that the Russian government and the Russian military doesn't have. It provides access to Russia, for Russia, to vital resources. And it's in the interest of the Kremlin to keep this going. But obviously, trying to then control it becomes ever more difficult. I mean, the Putin in particular, the Kremlin has set up the Wagner Group with a very important network and infrastructure in the United Arab Emirates, where most of their logistics and most of their finances are based. They have used the UAE as a hub to bypass sanction and to launder diamonds, oil, and most importantly, gold from Sudan, and use that cash from that sale and deposit it into banks in the UAE. So the United Arab Emirates are a key element in all of that, who, they themselves find it a very lucrative business and makes them immensely important for the Kremlin. The question really is to what extent Putin will clamp down on this infrastructure If he were to make a phone call to Mohammed bin Zayed, the president of the UAE, to say clamp down on these networks inside of your country, that would really break the backbone of Wagner, because they would not be able to operate independently from these networks.
There have been comments that Prigozhin needs to watch what he eats or to stay away from windows. It sounds that he's worth more to Putin alive rather than dead, though.
Yeah, I mean, rationality would tell us that it's probably not a good idea to get rid of him. But then again, most people didn't think that it was a rational idea to get involved in Ukraine, and Putin did it anyway. So I think Lavrov said on Monday, I think that he said that, whatever Wagner's doing overseas, we'll keep it untouched. We're only going to clamp down on them inside Russia and in terms of the operations in Ukraine. The question is, to what extent are they going to follow through? And obviously, the thing with Prigozhin is he's a ticking time bomb. He's got access to hundreds of millions of dollars. He's got access to a highly armed apparatus of mercenaries, maybe not in Ukraine anymore because they had to surrender some of their material, but they have a globally operating infrastructure that they can still rely upon. So I would rather look at Wagner as a global network, rather than, which is an entity in itself, rather than an adjunct to the Russian state. But you're right. I would say that in the way it is structured at the moment, Prigozhin, who also, by the way, has never said that he wants to get rid of Putin, it was more of a feud with the Ministry of Defense, he's not necessarily a threat to Putin per se, but he's a ticking time bomb, obviously, and he needs to be controlled. And I can't believe that he will stay in Belarus indefinitely if he has other options to go elsewhere.
With the changes in Russia in terms of the way that the military will operate and Wagner essentially being disbanded, how do you think the Russian military will manage without them?
No, that's a good question. I mean, it depends on what will happen to the core special forces operatives who really were the backbone of Wagner operations that made the company famous in Libya and also in Syria, because they were able to operate in a manner that, most of the Russian forces would not be able to do so. They operate as special forces independently with a chain of command that's fairly horizontal rather than vertical. And these people made a difference on the battlefield in Ukraine, and they kind of kept the war in Bakhmut going. They kind of held out despite all the onslaught from Ukrainian forces. So if they've gotten now the offer to join the military, I find it hard to believe that they will join the military, because they have more to gain if they go back to their units elsewhere across the world for Wagner, making a lot more money in a war effort that none of the inner core of Wagner anyway believes in terms of how it's been fought. And I also don't see that the Ministry of Defense in Russia is really learning its lessons. Instead of actually replying to what are quite legitimate grievances of Prigozhin over how this war's been fought, we see like they're doubling down, they're pushing back, and they're probably going to do business as usual, which so far has been a disaster for Russia. So I think it's going to be more of the same, unfortunately, without Wagner support, which is probably the beginning. It could be a turning point, let's put it this way, for sustaining the war effort, because Russia now, and Putin in particular, would have to raise more warm bodies elsewhere and throw them in the meat grinder of Ukraine. And those people he will find are probably not the sort of professional operatives that we are used to from Wagner, but are basically just warm bodies that will be used as cannon fodder.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Andreas Krieg is an Associate Professor of Security Studies at King's College London. You're listening to RM Breakfast.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.